Everybody, I'm Sarah, your Christian forgiveness coach, and you are watching Forgive Everyone for Everything Every Day Right Away. Today, I want to talk about having difficult conversations. So, I think about resentment. Like we've probably all experienced resentment, especially in our close relationships. So, I certainly know I'm very familiar with this emotion, but I have learned how to deal with it more effectively. So here's the main thing that I've learned. When it comes to getting rid of or preventing resentment, I had to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, like to be willing to speak up, to be willing to stand up for myself. But first, I needed to know what I wanted and why I wanted it, to get really clear and honest with myself about all of that first, and then be willing to have the other person not respond the way that I'd hoped, and then be able to work through that and still honoring myself through that process. So I had to stop wishing that my husband would just get it, wishing he would just magically understand me and know what it was that I wanted. But first, I had to know what I wanted. And that actually took a lot of time and life coaching, like to learn how to figure that out. So with me, when something would bother me or stress me out or upset me or frustrate me, I would try to like think my way out of it. I'd try to coach myself, get coaching, do my forgiveness work, forgive and bless, all of those things. And I'm not saying all that isn't great. And sometimes that does work. But other times I would do that and I would still feel this resentment building up. And I discovered for some things that it was because I wasn't speaking up about certain things that I wanted to speak up about. And by this time, I'd learned what I was wanting, but I wasn't expressing myself. I wasn't making myself clear. And I wasn't communicating my expectations. I was living in frustration and disappointment and this underlying resentment that I started to feel like the worst person ever. Because here I am, it's like, oh my gosh, I study forgiveness. I know how to do this thing. I know how to forgive and bless. I've been doing this for years. I've been taught so much about it, this one particular subject, and how to do it effectively. But here I was still missing something. And when you're married or in a close relationship, I've learned that the way you create more intimacy is by having those hard conversations. So for me, one day it started like this. I had been so frustrated about our lack of communication and our misunderstandings for several days. And coaching wasn't helping, and I was avoiding the hard conversation. I was emotional, I was on edge, I was distant, I was stressed to the point where my health was suffering. And I just knew that something needed to change. And it really hit me one morning when I was with my kids and I could not even concentrate on my time with them. I was so distracted by my emotions and my negative thinking about what my husband and I were going through, or what I thought we were going through. Go back to episode about mind drama, that I literally couldn't think straight. And I noticed that I was not at all present for my kids. I wasn't eating because I was stressed out. And I remember standing in the bathroom and I was like, this is enough. No matter what happens, I have to call him and just tell him how I feel and what I'm thinking. And I was scared, but I did it. And it was not an easy conversation. I'll tell you, we both got a little emotional and frustrated. But honestly, I stayed open to it and I could feel God moving in this conversation. There was something different about it. And I could feel more love for myself in this conversation. I was more focused on what I knew that I needed to be less stressed and therefore more present for my family. And that was to be able to speak my mind, to be able to tell my husband everything, and no matter what the outcome. And once I gave myself that gift, everything changed. Now, I'm not talking about making demands and pointing fingers and being selfish and whining and complaining. I'm talking about giving yourself the gift of knowing what you want, liking your reasons for it, and then being courageous enough to make it clear to someone else. And I learned to pay attention to how I felt during and after the conversation. So you'll know if your motives were maybe a bit off, if after the conversation you feel terrible, like you feel guilty and you feel that resentment. But if you feel like free and open and lighter and more loving after the conversation, then you have access to this gift. And for me, when I got it right, I did feel lighter. I felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I remember that day that I called him like 3 times, which is actually more times than I'd called him on the phone to talk, like in the last 6 months. We were also used to texting, right? So, and each time it got a little easier. We also talked more in person that night, like actually looking at each other, having a conversation. And it was one of the most fruitful conversations that we'd ever had. And the next day, something else transpired. And I immediately recognized like this negative feeling rising, and I could feel myself getting upset. And instead of turning to my journal this time and evaluating until I was blue in the face, I just called him. But this time it was even easier, and I was able to do it without fear. And I was able to do it with love. And I was like, what? I was shocked. Here, I've been stressing so much for so long about our lack of communication, about my poor ability to communicate. And here we were communicating effectively. And I'm so grateful for every part of all the work I've done around forgiveness, around life coaching, around all of it. I look back on the journey now, and yes, it was so hard. And I have no doubt more hard stuff is going to come. In fact, as recently as yesterday. But what makes the difference is, between now and then is I'm not scared anymore. I'm not scared to be uncomfortable. In fact, I'm like, bring it, because I find that when I move into that, I feel more free and alive, and I can literally just feel the stress melting away. I'm loving myself more by being willing to do this for me, and that love automatically transpires to my relationships. I'm not scared to have the hard conversation anymore, and I'm willing to be uncomfortable because I've finally decided to open up to it, to move into it, and to stop avoiding it, to stop trying to skirt around it, and stop trying to pretend it isn't there. So I had to figure out what I needed. Then I had to ask my husband for his help. And I had to do that. Like he didn't have to do anything different. And when I approached him in that way, instead of the way that I was approaching him, which was telling him everything he was doing wrong, then that's when everything changed, because it was about me. It wasn't about him or changing him or trying to get him to do this or that. It was about me and what I needed to do, which was love myself enough to figure out what I needed, love myself enough to express it, love myself enough to handle the hard stuff, the scariness, the discomfort, the emotions, love myself enough to find help to navigate that whole thing. So James 4 says, you do not have because you do not ask God. And scripture also tells us to have the right motive. So let's apply that to our marriage. Get our motives in check and then ask. We need to stop wishing that they would just get it or know or figure it out. Be mind readers, right? We're the ones who need to figure it out. And then if we want to ask. Get to where we can ask with the right motive, and you'll know, pay attention to how you feel. So yeah, I still get it wrong sometimes, but instead of dwelling on it for days and days like I used to, I've learned to just start noticing the precise moment when my feelings change. And then I can evaluate that and notice, oh, I ignored my need to speak up at that moment. And I went along with something like people pleasing. That's something I'll do an episode on, which is why I ended up being argumentative later. Like next time I'd like to try stopping in that moment and processing, not ignoring it, not people pleasing. Because people pleasing only builds resentment and then letting it spiral from there. And that has created the intimacy in my marriage that I have so desperately been searching for. But the key is, it started with the intimacy with myself first. And intimacy, I will tell you, is not all roses and chocolates. I used to think, oh, intimacy was when you're just happy all the time, all understanding and kisses and perfection, right? It's the hard stuff too. And because I've learned to accept the hard stuff, I'm no longer afraid of it. I know that I can handle it. Because remember, what's the worst thing that can happen? A feeling in your body, an emotion. So I want the same thing for all of you. And I hope my talks and my examples help, because if you're feeling frustrated and stressed and ready to give up on a relationship, I understand because I've been there. So I want to offer that you get willing to be uncomfortable. I promise you it's worth it. And remember, especially when it comes to asking for something that you want, if you never ask, the answer is already no. So isn't a little bit of discomfort worth the chance of a yes? So hope that helps. Done with love. Talk to you next time.